Thank you everyone for joining this webinar today. My name is Claire Nelson. I'll be moderating. I'm the co-founder and chief science officer at Cella. We're an in situ mineralization company. And so, today we're going to talk about why third-party verification matters, featuring guests from DNV and hopefully Gold Standard if, when Owen joins us, and of course from Climeworks as well. So just a quick overview of how today is going to go. We're going to introduce our panel and then dive right into the discussion. But first, we're going to clarify the terminology and go over what the technical terms MRV and certification actually mean. And then get into some discussion about why it's so important and how we can kind of set the standard going forward as we grow this industry. We're also going to discuss some learnings from past offset markets and redefining the difference between offsets and removals in terms of how we certify and verify what those things are, and also how those definitions relate to public perception. And then finally, we're going to hear from Friedel to hear more about Climeworks MRV efforts as a hands-on example, as they've set a really great standard. I almost said gold standard, but that is a separate meaning in this conversation. And then we'll end a bit early and leave some time for audience questions. So you can submit your questions throughout the webinar through the Q&A tool, and we'll get to as many as possible in the last 15 or so minutes of the webinar. So I guess I'll pass it over to our panel to introduce themselves, starting with Friedel.
Hi, my name is Friedel. I'm responsible at Climeworks for leading the MRV topic and developing internal processes to ensure that Climeworks is producing high quality CDR. So last year we developed our methodology along with the help of DNV to quantify the CDR produced by DAC and mineralization for a plant, specifically in Orca in Iceland. Leave on to Anirban.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I think really excited to be part of this conversation with Claire and Friedel, and hopefully Gwen will also join shortly. And I am based out of Mumbai, India, taking care of DNV's business development and climate change and ESG services. I am a passionate professional associated with the carbon market for last 1.5 decade, and also very much enthusiast about the CDR technology, how it is going to solve some of our pressing challenges. Today we are going to demystify some of the MRV terms and also have a very engaging conversation with Friedel and Claire. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining this panel. And I guess we'll continue without our third guest for now. Hopefully he'll join. He's probably having some technical problems. Anyways, okay, so yeah, like I said, the first thing we want to talk about is just clarify the terminology. I feel like MRV and reporting and certification and standardization have all been buzzwords that we hear come up in pretty much every conversation about carbon removal, which is a fantastic thing, of course, but I think it's important to all be on the same page about what that actually means, because we're in need of a framework that defines the quality criteria that a removal solution must meet. And it's important to scale not just any removal solution, but the high quality CDR solutions, so we can give confidence to buyers as this industry grows. So I'm going to ask our guest first, but then open it up to all of our panels about what do these technical terms, measurement, reporting, and verification actually mean? Can you break down what MRV stands for in simple terms? And we'll start with that.
Thank you, Claire. MRV, as it in terms of the literal meaning, monitoring, reporting, and verification. But before that, wanted to add one more word, is the measurement. While we are really progressing towards a strict regulatory regime for climate action. And that is very much needed today to really make the climate emitter or the carbon emitter accountable for their emissions, and which is causing global warming and then the catastrophic climate conditions what we are experiencing. So towards the same, before setting MRV system is what we all know, the old phrase that whatever you can measure, you can monitor. So that's why it's very important that every technology, every carbon accounting has a strong measurement value. And then if you are measuring it, then you can also monitor the progress from your baseline, from where you are today, where you want to be, and whether it is really meeting your stakeholders' requirements. Stakeholders could be your own organization, it could be or government, it could be any other industry sector at large. So these two terms are very much interrelated, and that's why the need and emphasis of the strong monitoring, reporting, and verification was felt not today, from the inception of this entire carbon market way back when we go back to Kyoto Protocol days and the inception of CDM. And it's very important to also understand the various other concepts associated with that. But then we will talk about briefly in the coming discussion, also along with the panelists. I would like to just end by saying an important aspect of MRV is what you also monitor, whether these are to the extent validated or verified by your third eye, whether you are not checking your own work and then just sharing what is your own performance, but someone else independently verifying the data, checking the completeness, accuracy, and validity of the monitoring and the reporting frameworks what you are using is very important for your stakeholders. That's why together, if we look at MRV is integral part of the any technological offsets or at large any carbon reduction projects.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely hear of measurement and monitoring being kind of substituted for this M in MRV. It's sometimes people say it's measurement, reporting, verification, some monitoring, but yeah, definitely love that you highlighted that it is at the core of this, and excited to hear towards the end of this webinar from Friedel how exactly Climeworks is measuring the removed carbon and how that is the foundation of MRV. And so, yeah, I guess I'll ask Friedel now if you have anything to comment on in terms of how you would like to clarify the terminology around MRV. And I guess I also should just ask you to briefly explain what your role is, because I could be wrong, but you might be the only person in CDR whose job exclusively is this, which I think is really exciting. Hopefully there's many more of you one day at every company. So yeah, I'd just love for you to comment on clarifying the terminology.
So for me, I think when we say MRV, we're already looking at a very project-focused way of assessing the outcomes of our projects, right? But I think it's important to remember that most of the time, and ideally, MRV is the next level below there already being a standard defining what you should be monitoring and what criteria you should be assessing your project towards, and then a methodology of how to apply that, how to reach that standard for your certain technology. And then the MRV to me really gets down to like, okay, how do we make sure that this project goes up that chain through the methodology and the standard? And I think that difference between monitoring and measuring, to me, I like to explain that as like, if somebody asks you to monitor, the casserole in the oven, they're not asking you to measure the temperature of it every 10 minutes. They're asking you to make sure it doesn't burn, right? There's kind of this expected criteria that you're watching out for. And so when we look at monitoring, there's already spelled out parameters and outcomes of those parameters that we're looking out for. And yeah, end of the day, we're measuring them, but the monitoring aspect comes with a lot of detail and expectations in there. So for us, that's a huge monitoring report that we fill out, monitoring plan and report of very detailed things. And then the reporting aspect of that, right? Of like, in what granularity are you actually recording all of these measurements and reporting them? And what's the robustness that those numbers can't be manipulated? And last, the verification is, okay, so you said you did all of this and you said it's all great and you met that methodology and that standard. Who's proving it, right? Like who's coming in like DNV and saying, okay, we checked all your numbers, you crossed your T's, dots your I's, everything adds up, right? That's how I would describe it, is in the practical sense on a project level.
I love that casserole in the oven analogy. It's definitely really helpful in clarifying the difference between measuring and monitoring. And yeah, so I guess that was a great tee up for my next question for Anirban, which is about, like, well, first of all, I'll just give a 10-second about what DNV does, but the core of my question is, how does MRV relate to certification, and what is the difference between verification and certification of a removal?
Exactly. DNV has its origin from Norway, and it's 160 years close to now origin, and our core business is into the risk assurance of the projects, and also verification, certification, and independent opinions are part of the offerings. When it comes to the verification methodologies, the independent verifiers like DNV look at this from absolutely criteria point of view. What are the defined criteria are in place to look at whether the monitoring and reporting is aligned with the defined criteria. And there are also various verification standards, and are available in line with ISO and other established mechanism. And ISO 14064 part 3 is one of the primary verification criteria, where auditors look at objectively the entire data and the underlying processes, how the entire verification activity can be conducted. And there are a lot of auditors attributes are also there in terms of checking the accuracy, completeness, and also reliability and consistency of the data, which is very much important, and especially new technologies like CDR, where there are less understanding are available in the market, how the technology works. And so it's very important to how the entire verification adds the credibility. The basic difference clear between the certification and verification is that there are the difference in the criteria. There are criteria available which can be called as certification standards, and there are guideline documents or practitioners reporting or MRV standards are available. So if the criteria is based on a certification standard with some specific criteria to also manage and meet the requirement, at the same time continually improve the performance with an objective of achieving an end goal, then we call it that as a certification against the criteria. But in case of a verification, it could be a data verification, it could be a process verification, and the outcome of any technology or any process is also called as verification. So in layman terms, verification is could be a subset of certification or a larger extent possible. Friedel,
That's
you'd like to add something?
I think that's a pretty robust answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely very robust. Thank you for that, painting the picture of the difference between verification and certification and why both are so important. So there's clearly a lot that goes into this. I mean, we just spent some time defining the terms and what the differences are, and there's a lot of intricacies. So some people might be at home thinking like, oh my gosh, this is such a daunting task. Like, are we just putting the cart before the horse, focusing so much on the standards and the qualities and the verifications. Like, we really need to get to scale. I mean, CDR's impact is inherently tied to how fast and how much the magnitude at which we can scale this. So yeah, I guess the question is, why is it so important that we're having these conversations now and that we're folding this into the CDR industry from the very start? And yeah, I think a lot of people might be thinking that it's maybe possibly just asking too much of these young companies and these nascent technologies to go through this. So why is it so important? I think I'll ask Friedel first.
Yeah, I mean, it's no denying that we need scalability, right? That we need many tons on the market. We're definitely in a climate crisis, but it's important that those tons mean something, that they count towards an actual ton of emissions in the atmosphere, right? So I think it's important to have these conversations now and defining those tons, defining the quality, as that also defines the metrics that companies should optimize for and build for, right? We see this in Climeworks. You can make lots of design decisions based on what you're designing for. If you have the MRV already in place, whether it's internal or external, that you're optimizing for including all the emissions that it takes to build your plant and buy the sorbent from cradle to grave, as Climeworks does, then it becomes very obvious that you're making many decisions based on those emissions rather than cost, right? We could replace our sorbent every other day and it would have higher efficiency. And so if we had MRV that says you don't have to take into account the emissions from the production of that sorbent, then yeah, very quickly, that's what you're incentivizing the market for, right? But if you have these conversations about MRV and you look at the considerations each different technology and solution is taking, you can start setting really high standards so that we make sure we scale with quality. I think it's you kind of need both conversations to happen at the same time also, right? You can't just have a conversation about MRV without knowing what technologies are in play, but it definitely needs to happen.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, is that, I mean, having these high standards from the get-go, I think will force innovation and really force people to really be creative on how to scale these solutions with the standards that have been set by the industry. So I guess I'll ask now, Anirban, like, what are these quality criteria that a CDR solution should meet? And yeah, if you could just go over, like, what are the different aspects of a high quality removal?
Yeah, just Claire wanted to also share the world. I mean, the concept of carbon capture is not new. You know, today, as old as 1972, if I'm correct, that the first carbon capture was proposed, and then 24 years later in Norway, especially in the North Sea, the oil and gas industry was a pioneer in terms of capturing the carbon because they were seemed to be the largest emitter. But then as we progress, and then we are really witnessing the impact of kind of climate change, it's very important that the assertion of what the organizations are making in terms of their reduction, and in the advent of new technologies like CDR, which is gaining very importance because as per latest IPCC report, by 2050, in order to achieve Paris climate goal of 1.5 degree limiting temperature, there is estimated that 10 billion ton per year, the carbon removal technologies need to scale up, and then that need to double up till end of the century. So it's very important that all these data or the claims are define the fundamental essence of the objective of those projects, whether we are really achieving our climate goals or not, and then whether these projects are really creating an impact, because these are not very easy projects also to come into operations. This requires a lot of funding, a lot of aspects of technology, as well as the accounting, and how these projects are going to really solve the emission trajectory, reduction trajectories of countries, organizations or communities, because what we are seeing, some of the largest emitters of the world are really thinking how they are going to meet the climate change reduction targets. We are seeing COP after COP. A lot of aspects of climate commitments are coming, but in reality, the parts per million carbon dioxide level every year is going up. So that's why the quality criteria of these projects are very important, and solutions need to look at the durability of the project, whether this is going to be a one-off project or this is going to consistently create the impact. For example, CDR, I think the Climeworks projects, it has a potential to remove approximately 3,000 tons of carbon from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide for the atmosphere. And but initially this will the design capacity must be 4,000, but then initially when we started, it has started with 1,100 to 1,500, and then we have also verified those numbers in quarter. So the durability of the project is very important. And another aspect which the organizations, or there are a lot of UN cry sometimes happening with specific methodologies, is that whether the project is really doing an additional removal. So compared to any other carbon reduction project, carbon removal technologies give that additionality criteria very well ticked. And that's why there is again a lot of importance, and using technology you can and the mineralization, it is very easier to also quantify how much of the carbon dioxide is absorbed through the chemical as well as other processes. And whether another aspect is that very important, that we have seen carbon capture and storage related to the transportation and the storage part of it, whether the storage of the carbon is happening in the form of mineralization, or it is happening in the form of any kind of aquifer storage in the deep oil shell, and whether the topography or geological conditions are sufficient, there won't be any leakage. Because in terms of capturing carbon, and if you are storing, and if there is a leakage, then again the entire effort goes in vain. And then in terms of compliance from the traditional carbon offset projects, how it is different. So the quality of the purchase CDR over any other carbon credits or offset is very important to demonstrate. And that's why we are seeing in the voluntary carbon market, the acceptance of CDR has placed as a separate category. And that's why we are seeing a lot of investment in this area. And then Climeworks is really pioneering this technology and scaling up in different markets to support the industry. Sorry.
Thank you for that, Anirban. That was really helpful. And I think it may just occurred to me that the audience might know some of these terms. So Friedel, at least additionality, because that's something that's really critical, and I think kind of a newer thing that's discussed. And after this, I'm going to kind of ask some questions about the past version of the offset market. And I think that talking about additionality really sets that up nicely. So could you just give the audience a quick overview of what that actually means, what that is?
Yeah, additionality is definitely one of the trickiest ones on this list. I think also in all these conversations with new technologies and new players, right? I think we confuse different aspects of it. But I think bottom line, and Anirban, correct me if I have a different interpretation than you want to use, but it's basically, would this project occur without the funding and without the carbon market supporting it, right? So it's financial or just natural reductions, like it's trying to mitigate you claiming a credit for something that would have happened already without that incentive.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I just also got word that Owen from Gold Standard won't be joining us, unfortunately, but we are already having a great discussion with the panelists that we have. So we're just gonna move forward without that. So sorry that he can't join everyone. So yeah, I guess before we move on to talk about kind of learnings from the past offset market and the way that these different terms that you see on the slide are so important to move on going forward. I just wanted to ask something different to Anirban about scale, particularly because all the work that DNV does of really scrutinizing the technology of different projects and different companies so that the customers don't have to do that themselves before they make a purchasing decision. I mean, it's a lot of work. A lot of work goes into this and a lot of people's time and experts' time. So I just was wondering if you could give the audience a quick overview of digitalization efforts, because I think that's something that we're seeing popping up a lot on like marketplaces and digitalizing this sort of verification and certification. And I guess just what we deem high quality and not is really being incorporated into digitalization efforts. So hopefully you could just give a quick overview of what you're doing in that regard.
Thank you, Claire. I think you have raised a very important aspect for scalability. Although it's not mentioned on the slide, but every technological invention needs to be more commercialized and scaled and make it more affordable. What we are also seeing it globally now, whether it is CDR or any other of traditional offset market project, there is a lot of bottleneck in terms of the verification or validation of the projects, and then the competent project, I mean, the supported by all the real-time data are getting very challenged, and proving additionality, what Friedel was just very sweetly summarized, is getting a challenge. And then when you look at the capital market, which is really up for green finance, and and then we are seeing a lot of renewable infrastructure is on the growing, and then that's the obvious need also for the energy transition. We also have to look at how the capital market can also be linked with the carbon market or a carbon finance going forward, because while at the same time we are looking at energy transition by renewable energy, or more switching to the more cleaner fuel, hydrogen per se, and also improving storage, the entire value chain emission for these projects are really high, and that is raising concern. And still the energy transition companies, especially oil and gas and other hard to abate sectors, need the carbon offset or removal to achieve the net zero goal, because unless the residual footprint is also looked at. So from a scalability point of view, that's why it's very important that the MRV technologies are digitized in a fashion that from designing the project document to the verification methodologies, or the calculation methodologies, and the verification technique, those are all kind of developed on a common database or a platform, even using DLTs, distributed ledger technologies. And there are a lot of startups ecosystem. In fact, today Wen would have been a great contributor to that fact. Gold Standard and other voluntary carbon schemes are coming out with digital MRVs technologies to validate and verify this CDR and other offsets methodologies. In fact, I would take a little bit of liberty to share what Gold Standard is doing. They are basically bringing the ecosystem together in terms of the climate solutions provider, and as well as verification or MRV players like us, and coming out with the methodology of each and every aspect of the MRV, whether it is monitoring part using IoT sensors, and making the data available on a real-time basis is very important, and so as to minimize human error or interventions in terms of manual collection and aggregation. plus also looking at how the verification and the validation of the methodologies can be accelerated to have a large number of projects registered on the registry, carbon registries like Gold Standard, Vera, or even any of the national carbon registries as per Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. And we will also see more when the new Article 6.4 mechanisms will come into the place in couple of years. Carbon removal will be an essential aspect of it, which is the supervisory committee under UNFCCC is debating at this point of time how it will. But then digital will play a very important role to get more projects having a more credible mechanism to verify the numbers under the same mechanism. And then the world will have more, or the communities will have more carbon credits or CDR credits available to purchase. So that's why we are looking at the entire digitalization as a very important aspect to scale up, in addition to the other aspects of durability, additionality, and materiality. Thank you.
Thanks. Friedel, do you have any comments to add to that as well?
No, I think it's just exciting, right? I think, yeah, not much more to add there. I'll let them go.
Okay, great. Yeah, Anirban, you brought up a really good point. I think you mentioned the importance of MRV, not just for the removal itself, but along the whole value chain and emissions kind of along the way that go into implementing these technologies, especially at early scale when the magnitude of removals is still quite small. And while life cycle analyses are a topic for a separate webinar, it did kind of make me think that that is a question that I get a lot personally, is people say, well, how do we know that it's actually removing more than you're producing to make this project happen? And I think that the fundamental underlying question here is just reflects some level of skepticism that the public has towards carbon removal currently. And I mean, we talked about the importance of public perception and of course trust when we were talking about why it's so important. But I think that it's just so critical and deserves to be talked about endlessly, public perception and social acceptance of this, because we need it to gain tax-funded support from governments and community support for projects, and of course, financial support from buyers. So a lot of methods of carbon offsetting, and I know that's different than removal, have come kind of under fire in the media recently. Some investigative reports have recently been uncovered that many offset projects don't actually deliver on what they promise, which I think is reflected in the skepticism that we get asked about, like, how do we know that we're actually net removing CO2? So I think this is a good just thing to touch on, is in the context of the criticism that the carbon markets have been receiving recently. What are the learnings that we can take away from past mistakes, both in terms of actually the MRV of verifying removal, but also the way that we talk about this to the public, and how can we kind of just reset and change that narrative and change the methods going forward in the emerging removals market. So I guess maybe before I go into that, maybe Friedel can just quickly tell the audience the difference between a removal and an offset as it was defined kind of in the past in these projects that have been criticized, because I just want to be clear.
Yeah, so like general carbon market that we speak of, there's many carbon markets, but the one we speak of predominantly, it's really started with an effort in the 1990s to reduce emissions, right? So then the science was saying, and our emission levels were low enough that, hey, if we just reduce our emissions to about 5% 1990 levels, then we can kind of stay under this critical threshold. And so the effort was targeted at select heavy industries and as kind of a cap and trade type of carbon market, right? So the whole idea was, okay, you can reduce your emissions. If you reduce your emissions below your target value easily, then you can sell those extra reductions to other industry players who are having a more difficult time reducing their emissions. And so it's really kind of the idea of putting a scrubber on your smokestack, right? And your measurement there is the delta of what you were emitting on your baseline year versus what you're emitting in your recording year. And then we get the removals, which is what Climeworks is doing with a technology removal, but also where trees had entered into the equation, right? And saying, hey, okay, the goal here is reducing atmospheric emissions. We can do that through reductions in our emissions from heavy industry, but maybe we can also increase the efficacy of trees pulling emissions out of the atmosphere, and kind of from that same emissions level in the atmosphere, still taking a negative, but from a different approach, right? And so what we see there is these are actually different baselines, and especially it's very clear when you look at Climeworks. You know, in an essence, you can argue on very oversimplified, not accurate technology terms that we're basically a scrubber just floating in the air, right? And pulling emissions out of the atmosphere. And then you can see the differences of what's the difference between a scrubber and a smokestack of what's getting a reduction credit versus Climeworks DAC unit that's getting a removals credit. And the thing there is that it's a lot more energy, first of all, like effort wise, not like necessarily electricity, to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere where it's at this very low concentration, right? So you have that effort. It's kind of similar to making the comparison of, can you scoop me a cup of flour out of a flour sack versus asking me to gather a cup of flour that's been spilled all over the floor, right? It's a lot more effort to get it off of the floor. The other thing that we see is the intentions are very different, right? So when you're looking at a reduction, then you already assume that the power plant was there, right? The infrastructure there isn't what you're trying to reduce. You're trying to reduce the operational emissions that it's conducting. So you're really just looking at that emission differences between 2 years. Whereas for DAC, what we're doing is we're saying baseline is 0, right? So every kilo of steel that goes into building our plant, everything that comes into it onto that ground zero gets factored into the emissions that we take into consideration when calculating the CDR as the net negative emissions from that project. And that's not necessary for a reduction effort. And so there's many things about this that the quantifications are different, right? But then also the targeted emissions are different. So if we look at the recommended science right now, it's very obvious that yes, in order to avoid a total catastrophe, we need to focus 90% of our efforts on reducing our emissions, right? DAC will never scale, and all the other solutions of removals will never scale enough for us to just continue on emitting the way we are and then producing and buying removals. We really have to focus on these reductions. And so we're addressing that these are two different things, targeting those two different emissions, right? Removals is targeting those unavoidable emissions that are already in the atmosphere. They're agnostic of technology, they're agnostic of vintage, and they're those emissions that no matter how efficient we get, they'll still always be there. That's kind of the last hoovering of the flour on the ground, right? That you couldn't sweep up, you couldn't gather up with your hands. You're like, okay, now we need to hoover it up. That's what DAC is there for. So that's the high level differentiation between reductions and removals.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that analogy as well. And it was definitely really clear about how different they are and how we need both. But yeah, in the context of the past offset market, which has definitely kind of dipped its toe into both of those things, and I think muddied the waters between removals versus reductions. What can we learn from the past mistakes, I guess, and how can we reset? So I'm going to ask Anirban to give us a quick answer, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, another important aspect is that the challenges sometimes the removal technologies are facing is that in terms of the storage, the mineralization aspect also. I would love to hear also your thought, Claire, is that how it would be helpful in terms of this variation in the permanence of the carbon storage, because there are a lot of doubts, or it's not proven impact is not there, and then whether as Claire as Friedel mentioned about the variation from the previous carbon offset market and other technology, it's very important to know that how the entire carbon removal technology will have an impact on this permanence aspect. And I think very important analogy what Friedel has mentioned. But you see the scalability of these projects will also need entire ecosystem, especially the government support, how this can become affordable, how this can go side by side in traditional offset projects, and then how this can add a more layer of removal that the entire industry need to do it. It cannot be only applied as a single solution. It has to look at from a combination of all the solutions to achieve the desired impact. And that has to happen continually. So that's the aspect. I think still the ecosystem is learning, the technology is premature, and we need more awareness.
Yeah, thank you. And I know you asked about mineralization, but I think that's a good segue to have Friedel tell us about how this process all works in Orca, because that's the storage mechanism that they use there, of course, for their first of its kind plant. So yeah, I know I want to leave time for audience questions, and this discussion's been really great, but I do want to give Friedel an opportunity to really give us an example of how this looks and what Climeworks has done in Iceland, and yeah, the steps that you took to get that third-party verification by DNV for that project, which was really groundbreaking.
Thank you. Yeah, so I can't speak on mineralization in too much detail, right, as that's what our storage partner Carfix does, and fortunately they're not here to answer those details. But in terms of the verification process, I think it's really easy for people to assume that, you know, verification is just this one little stop that you have between producing CDR and selling it, right? That you're like, great, stamp of approval, it's a done deal. When really verification in MRV is so embedded in your whole business model, right? It really determines where you put your plants, the sensors you use, it's the price point at what you're at, you know, the quality of how MRV is defined in the industry. And it's really something that starts in your thought process, in your project development phase. And so, you know, the first steps are really connecting with your verifier and figuring out what do you need, like what requirements do you need to get ready. Hopefully you already have a standard and methodology there, your technology is represented here, and you can just sign up and go through the processes. But in our case, being a new technology, we developed a methodology according to ISO standards that are best suited at the time. And then you really get into the nitty-gritty of like, okay, how do you, per project, identify how you're going to operate every aspect of that project, right? Under good conditions, under, okay, if this sensor's down, bad conditions, what exactly are you going to monitor, right? And with what equipment, with what accuracy, and you spell out basically this giant contract that's between you and the standard that says, this is how I will meet the methodology, I claim I will, and this is how I will operate, right? And then you build your plant and you have all your sensors in place as you said you would, and you collect all your information as you said you would. You do everything according to that project design document and monitoring plan. And then finally comes the day that you're like, great, we have enough CDR. Let's call in the auditor and have our work checked and see if we did it according to our plan. And then they come in and it's like the most nerve-wracking day, and you're just get interrogated, right? The first time, and then every few years after, it's on site. So the auditor comes in and they look at all of your operations, make sure your specs of how your plant is set up and the sensors you use are according to that project design document and through your specifications. And then they also go through all of your data, right? Is your data recording stuff accurately? Is it manipulatable? Is there backups to it? Not only is your process running as you said it would, but is it operating with enough robustness and trust that we can assure you're going to have quality results in years to come, right? And for the next phases. And then they write up a report, and usually there's one or two little things that's like, you can improve on this, right? Hopefully you don't have any major non-compliances of like, we can't issue your verified CDR because turns out, you know, whatever. But then you get this report and it says you did everything as you said you would, maybe make an improvement here. And then you get to deliver this to your customers, right? And then the next time around, it's not even just how does your plant operate, but it's really your whole value stream. It's okay, did you actually deliver this CDR to your customers the way you intended? Is it only counted once? Is all the accounting for that in accordance, right? And additionally, there's just layers of all the claims you make in your contracts. Are they abided by? So it's a very thorough and, like I say, kind of daunting experience going through these audits. Even the fourth time around where you're like, nothing has changed. We've done everything well. Everybody's always sitting tight and like, okay, did we do it? Fine, phew, take a breath, right? But it's pretty great. Like, I think it's something for me that has given me a lot of trust in carbon markets, and knowing that this is happening for all different projects, right? And like you said, Claire, in the news, there's been a lot of debate of like, are carbon markets effective? And I think, yeah, there's definitely room where we can improve things, but this third-party verifying process, I think is really great. And anybody who's been through it can see just how thorough it is.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, I guess that was really helpful, and I'm gonna switch gears into audience questions now, and that's kind of the perfect segue into our first audience question that I'm gonna ask to Anirban, which is, given how daunting this process is, and all the time and energy, and the fact that a lot of CDR suppliers are still really small and early stage with limited resources, when is the best time for a startup to begin their search for third-party validation, and where would they even begin to take steps towards getting that?
I think it's a great questions, and I would like to also take example of Climeworks. While Friedel was mentioning about the entire narrating the process, actually the design part of the process includes the best preparation for the verification, and I would like to take an example. One could be a important question like how your processes are actually supporting the data collection you are doing. So it has to be really process driven, and at the same time can have all the evidences. It could be a digital evidence, it could be a physical evidence, but those evidences need to be in place. So while we cannot really wait for the verification that after the project will end and the CDR is generated, then only we will think for verification, because it's linked with the credibility and the trust, as Friedel was mentioning. It needs to be incorporated from the design of the project itself. Okay, and at the same time, one interesting experience from the Orca project, what we had is that, the methodology was, as in line with the ISO 14064 standard, everything was good. But then one question came to the auditor's mind that, how do you think that the metering of this entire CO2 gas, when, it's actually crossing the system boundary in the downstream, is actually not, you have a, control of it, because your operational boundary is the plant itself, and then, we are storing it somewhere else. So whether you have any control of that process, or do you take care of that aspect? So unless the entire project design concept, these areas are not considered, it would be very difficult to kind of face the verification. But I would just say that verifiers are actually a critical friend, but they are basically helping the entire process to be more credible. That's it. Hope that answers.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I guess that's a good, in that context, I mean, why is Climeworks developing its own standard / methodology? A question for Friedel. And I guess, how does that relate to this third-party verification process? I mean, what's the importance of this, I guess?
Yeah. I'll clarify with the easy one first. Like, we're not trying to create our own standard, right? Our whole hope is for there to be a fungible ton of CDR defined, so that we take this, all the hard work that the verifiers do away from the consumer, right? Ultimately, that's one of the goals of having a standard, is having a fungible ton, that universal ton defined, so that everybody knows, okay, this is a quality, right? Under gold standard, under whatever standard, this is what a ton means. And they don't have to do what the verifier does and come and audit all of your data, right? Because it takes an expert to do that, and it takes at least a full day of being in our databases. Why we're defining or developing our own methodology? Simply because we were the first, right? And there was no methodology to follow. But I also think that it's important to recognize that the verification is third party. And I think even in the standard, or even in the methodology development, you'll always have a bit of involvement from the projects themselves, just because you can be an expert at auditing a process, right? But you weren't necessarily an expert in developing that technology. And so nobody knows better than the technology developer where things can fail and where things really need to be measured and monitored. And yeah, that's always going to be a bit of a dialogue between the two, right? You have the methodology gets validated through a similar process with your third party, where they make sure that the approaches you're taking are robust enough and really meet the standard that you're trying to meet, and are meeting industry standards where there isn't necessarily indication in the standard. But yeah, in the end, I think technologies will always be developing, in some sense, the methodologies. And if you're the first, you have to do more of that legwork. If you're the second or third, you can maybe make modifications and give your input of, hey, Climeworks DAC works this way, and that's not totally applicable to our DAC technology. And maybe there's adaptations of the methodologies evolving.
Yeah, definitely interesting. And I know that we're almost out of time here, and I want to give a little minute at the end to thank everyone. But there's one other question that just came in from the audience that I think is really interesting and important, and ties back into what we were discussing earlier. Somebody asked, as you mentioned before, recent criticism about overcrediting or about carbon offsets projects has shattered trust in certification agencies. So I think earlier we talked a little bit about trust in the context of CDR industry and the projects and the technology. But this is asking a little bit more about trust in the certification agency and in the verifier. And like what you just said, Friedel, of developing a methodology that's transparent and kind of involved with each project. And that is something that might help, that I hopefully will help. But Anirban, how are you thinking about how to gain back trust yourself in this context?
Yeah, I think it's very important that as the technology is emerging, and there are a lot of buyers and sellers of carbon CDR credits. So the trust for particular certification body or a verification agency can only be enhanced if they perceive to be competent. The organization is having a very solid foundation of independence and management of impartiality. Because suppose it's DNV today who has partnered with Climeworks for this pioneering technology, and now it's getting also scaling up. We have to also look at in this entire process, how was the independence of the individual auditors also, whether they are part of the technology or they have any related interest in this entire process, or any kind of they are the investor in the technology. So really proving independence and impartiality is a need of the hour. And that's why, there is also a lot of climate rating agencies are coming who are only creating, kind of the research data and then do rating on their own research. So that's why it's very important today that there are regulations coming to also look at the work of the verification agencies. That's why there is a concept called accreditation. There is another ISO standard called ISO 14065, which gives the clear-cut guideline for competence management, for the how management of impartiality, and then how the independence can be upheld. So with that aspects, we are, DNV being, one of the oldest certification body in the field and always dependent on research and innovation, we are able to prove our credibility in the market. And that's why this project also got a lot of attention.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that answer, and a kind of perfect timing. So we only have a minute left, but I just wanted to take this last minute to thank our audience for coming, and of course, thank our panelists for speaking. This has been a really important and valuable discussion. Hopefully our audience feels the same, and you can let Climeworks know by scanning this QR code and giving some feedback on today's event. So be sure to follow DNV and Climeworks and Gold Standard and Cella on LinkedIn and social media, whatever, just to, if you're interested in learning more about our companies. And I think lastly, I can give a plug for the Climeworks Stack Summit, which is open to everyone. You can register to attend virtually, and you can find that on their website or their LinkedIn. So thank you all for coming, and thank you again to our speakers, and everyone have a good day.
Thank you, Claire, Friedel, for an engaging discussion. Looking
Likewise,
forward to continue the momentum of the CDR in the market together and with the audience, of course. Have a great day.